All right, welcome back and congrats on finishing the written test. Next, we'll be moving on to our speaker portion of EconBowl. We're incredibly lucky to have Professor Lawerence White from NYU Stern here with us today to speak about antitrust. Professor White received his PhD in economics from Harvard University and holds the Robert Kavesh Professorship in economics. He has been with New York University Leonard and Stern School of Business for over 40 years. Professor White has published numerous articles in the Journal of Business, Journal of Economic Perspectives, and more, and is the author of the SNL Debacle Public Policy Lessons for Bank and Thrift Regulation. Before we get started, I'd like to go over how questions and discussions will be facilitated today. If you would like to speak or have any questions during the presentation, we will have two options. You can either raise your hand in the participants panel and we will allow you to unmute yourself to speak. We will also be taking questions through chat if you would rather use that feature, so please send them there. Please keep the chat appropriate and refrain from spamming, or else we will have to close it and may remove you from this meeting. Now, everyone, please welcome Professor White.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Alyssa. Let me say, I'm late to the party here. I understand the finals have happened. Has there been a winner declared, a winning team declared yet?
So we actually just had our written round competition, so finals have not happened yet. A winner has not been decided
yet.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I wish good luck to the finalists and hope it all comes out well. Now, remind me, Alyssa, when would you like me to be winding up? How much time do I have?
You can have around like 45 minutes or even 45. To like an hour if you want.
Up to an hour?
Yep.
But I don't want to push my luck. So good. All right. So thank you very much for this opportunity. When I looked at the number of attendees, it was north of 200. I've spoken to large groups of individuals in large auditoriums, but I'm pretty sure that in terms of a Zoom type remote speaking opportunity, this is my largest remote speaking opportunity ever. I'm truly pleased to have this opportunity. All right, so let me share the screen. And let me start from the beginning. Alyssa, can you see the slides? Always need to ask, make sure the technology is working.
Yep, I can see it.
Wonderful. All right. So I told Alyssa when we talked, what was it, a month and a half ago, that I wanted to talk about antitrust, that it was starting to come into the news. Little did I know at the time that just 2 or 3 weeks before I would have the opportunity to talk, the U.S. Department of Justice would be filing a major antitrust suit against Google, and I will want to talk about that. And as it turns out, just this past week, the U.S. Department of Justice has filed a suit to try to stop the merger of Visa, the credit card company, with Plaid, a startup, a digital payments infrastructure company. So I'm not going to talk about the Visa Plaid case. I know much less about that. But I do know something about the Justice Department suit against Google. So let me proceed. Let me first say, you'll notice on this slide, I've got my email address there. If anyone would like to pursue any of the topics, ideas that I'm going to be talking about today, you have my email address. You know how to find me. And Alyssa, when I'm finished, I'm going to email to you the slide deck. And if you would like to distribute it to the participants, please feel free. This is a publicly available document.
Yeah,
So,
definitely.
okay, good. So, first, Alyssa gave you a little bit of a background on me. Let me give you a little bit more. As you can see, I got my PhD a while back. I lived and worked in Pakistan and Indonesia immediately after getting my degree. Then I started teaching at Princeton, taught there for 6 years. I moved on to Stern. I've been at Stern since the fall of 1976. If you do the math, and I'm sure all of you can do the math, you will realize that this is my 45th year at Stern. I am a lifer. And so, uh, you know, Stern has been a very good environment for me. I've served in the United States government 3 times. The first time was during the Jimmy Carter administration. I was on the senior staff of the President's Council of Economic Advisor. I was taking leave from NYU. I went there for a year. They wanted me to stay longer. I happily came back to NYU. A few years later, I had the opportunity to become the chief economist of the Antitrust Division of the US Department of Justice, which is where a lot of my understanding of antitrust policy has come from. I served for a year and a half. They wanted me to stay longer. I happily came back to NYU. Among my, my proud, pleased to talk about accomplishments there. I was one of the co-authors of what came to be known as the 1982 merger guidelines. And the guidelines in various forms have now for not quite 40 years continued to be the bedrock of merger policy in the United States, and that some version of what we developed in 1982 with the modifications over the past 38 years have come to really shape merger policy in almost every jurisdiction that has some kind of antitrust or competition policy framework. And my third tour of duty was as one of the regulators of this, what was then called the savings and loan industry. I served for almost 3 years on the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, which was the regulator of the savings and loan industry. At the end of the 3 years, this was not a good time for the savings and loan industry. They didn't want me to stay any longer. I happily came back to NYU the third time and for good. My research, my writing involves antitrust. Notice I put it first: regulation, financial institutions. And given that the savings and loan industry was focused very much on providing residential mortgages, I learned a lot and have written about residential housing finance. So that's me in summary. And now, like any good business school professor, I got to tell you what I'm going to say. I'm going to say it, and then I'll tell you what I said. I want to start out by talking about markets, their strengths, but also there can be market failures. Then I'll talk about antitrust, give you a very brief history of its origins, talk about why antitrust is a valuable part of the policy framework of any modern economy. I'll give you some specifics, essentially about the US antitrust framework, what's covered, how it's enforced. I'll talk about alternatives. I'll talk about exemptions. I'll briefly go over some recent and current controversies, and then I'll spend toward the end some time on the recent. I mean, literally, they filed that suit 3 weeks ago, the US v. Google suit. And of course, I'll tell you what I say. So I start out with a simple piece of geometry. This is the simple supply-demand framework that every introductory course in microeconomics starts out with. Price on the vertical axis, quantity on the horizontal axis, a demand curve that slopes down and to the right, a supply curve that slopes up and to the right, and the crossing of the two curves, the equilibrium price, P little e, the equilibrium quantity, Q little e, and after getting the initial idea of equilibrium price, equilibrium quantity, the concept of consumer surplus, CS, the area below the demand curve, where the demand curve represents the willingness to pay, the area below the willingness to pay, but above the price, PE, that is actually paid, and producer surplus, PS, the area above the supply curve representing a willingness to supply, and the price that is actually received in the marketplace, the PE. And the standard diagram shows those two triangles or some aggregate combination of the two. Those are triangles if these are linear representations of demand and supply. And this is a rough and ready indication of social welfare, of the aggregate of what consumers gain, what producers gain, and those who wax rhapsodic about a market system will usually, at least in their heads, have some notion of this kind of framework, that a market system, by competition on the one side, consumers pursuing their own best interest on the other side, maximizing the aggregate welfare outcome. So anybody who waxes rhapsodic about markets, he or she is basically referring to, often won't show you, but referring to this kind of diagram. All right. And so it's important to remember just what those strengths of markets are. They allow consumers to find and to buy what's best for themselves. And the common phrase that the economists will use will be utility maximization. Markets allow producers to produce and sell what they are best at doing, profit maximization. And something that is not readily shown on that diagram, but that profit maximization encourages, seeking gain, if you like, on the part of the producers. They're encouraged to reduce their costs, become more efficient, and to innovate, to find either even better ways to become more efficient or to find better products that can meet demand and allow the producer to earn profits. So allowing consumers to maximize utility, allowing producers maximize profits, and maximizing the sum of that, the consumer surplus plus producer surplus, plus again, the incentive to reduce costs, become more efficient, and to innovate. That's the basic market story, but also, and this is something that gets talked about less nowadays than when I was going through my economics education, central direction isn't needed in this kind of framework. The firms figure it out, the consumers figure it out, and there's an overall economizing on the use of information. All right, So, however, and I think it's really important anytime you hear somebody waxing rhapsodic about markets, to remember that the optimality of unfettered, people describe themselves as free markets oriented. You will never hear me describe myself that way. I am markets oriented, as I think will be clear from my presentation, but markets can have problems. And I think it's important to recognize those problems. The optimality, in the sense, the optimality of the outcome rests on some important assumptions that usually are not mentioned when you've got those free market types who are waxing rhapsodic. First, they're assuming vigorous competition, no market power, no monopoly, no oligopoly. Obviously, that's the subject of the main bulk of what I'm going to talk about today. But I think it's important to remember that there are other drawbacks to markets as well. They're assuming no externalities, no spillovers. The common examples of these kinds of spillovers: environmental pollution, neighborhood effects. And it's important to remember spillovers can go either in the negative direction, environmental pollution, degradation of a neighborhood, or they can go in a positive direction, that by sprucing up the front of your house, you are providing benefits, externality, spillovers to everybody else in the neighborhood. Either way, there's a failing of markets, because markets don't normally, unless there's some extra mechanism, take into account externalities or spillovers. Further, there's no information asymmetries. The assumption is everybody knows everything. Well, what happens if sellers know more about their product than do buyers? So that's a simple example of an information asymmetry, and there's been a lot of productive work in economics over the last 50 years, exploring what happens to markets when there are information asymmetries, and also exploring how markets can try to compensate for those kinds of asymmetries, sometimes more successfully, sometimes less. Some important Nobel Prizes have been won by individuals who were doing deep research on information asymmetries. And the last important assumption is that participants know their own best interests, that the buyers, as well as the sellers, but especially the buyers, are making reasoned choices. If you remove that, then that picture of consumer surplus no longer quite resonates if people are not making the best choices in their own best interest, et cetera. And the last thing, and notice I have underlined this, that market outcome is agnostic about income distribution, has nothing to say about income distribution. It's just taking consumers as who they are, producers who they are, and maximizing. So nowadays, as we know, there's a great deal more concern about income distribution. The standard market outcome, it tells you nothing about, the judgment about markets outcomes, that optimality of unfettered markets, absolutely silent on income distribution. All right, so now I needed to provide that background. Let me talk about antitrust. And antitrust are laws and policies to deal with the creation, enhancement, and exercise of market power. Market power is the economist's somewhat fancy phrase for what non-economists often describe as, the positions and the exercise of monopoly power or oligopoly power. And I'm going to go into greater detail, but among the areas covered by by antitrust are price fixing, which are explicit, collusive, joint, monopolistic behavior, and other anti-competitive agreements, mergers that create or enhance market power, or unilateral actions. And we'll be coming back to a lot of these things. It's important to remember antitrust is not about pure size. It's about market power. It's not about pure size. Sometimes size is associated with market power, but it need not be. And so that gets forgotten sometimes in the public conversations about antitrust. Also, antitrust doesn't address other market failures. It's not going to cure pollution problems. It's not going to cure asymmetric information problems. It's not going to cure the common cold. And alas, it's not going to do much for dealing with COVID. It deals with market power issues. And then the last thing just to remember is that outside of the United States, the term antitrust is a uniquely US phrase. Outside, more often you will see the phrase competition policy, but we're talking about the same. We're talking about the same thing. Alyssa, should I stop? Are there any comments? Anybody want to ask a question or offer any comments or anything?
We don't have any questions in the chat right now, but we can definitely open it up and see if anyone has any.
Okay. I'm happy to, if there's anybody. If not, let me go on. But Alyssa, something comes up, just let me know. I'm happy to stop and see what people would like to ask.
Yeah. One person actually asked in chat, what is oligopoly?
Good. Okay. Oligopoly is the monopoly, one seller in a market. Ola is, I think it's Greek for more than one. And so it's a situation where there are a few, more than one, not many, but a few sellers in a market. And so that's and we'll be talking a little bit about oligopoly as we go along here. But good, glad we had the opportunity to clarify that. Anything else?
Yeah, we had another person ask, what was the issue with Facebook and antitrust? Would their issues be considered unilateral actions?
So I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure I understood. Say again, please.
The question is, what was the issue with Facebook and antitrust? Would their issues be considered unilateral actions?
Good. All right. Can we come back to that? Hold on to that question. And I want to talk a bit more about what antitrust is about, tell you a little bit about the Department of Justice case. I think we'll have time to, I do mention very briefly Facebook, and so let's come back to that. But okay, so why don't we go on? So when I think about antitrust and monopoly, of course, I've got to show you this particular figure from, shall we say, a popular board game. All right, here, when an economist is thinking about monopoly, he or she typically has this kind of diagram in his or her head where we've got a demand curve. That's this straight line D curve. At a high price, people buy less. At a low price, people buy more. We've got a cost structure that, just to make things simple, is a what's called constant long run marginal cost, which this is greater technicality than we need, long equal to long run average cost. And for a competitive industry, that would be the supply curve for that industry. But and given that demand, given that cost structure, the competitive price would be a price of PC. The competitive aggregate quantity by all the producers in the competitive industry would be QC. If that otherwise similar industry is converted into a monopolist, the monopolist will restrict quantity, will raise price, so that the monopoly outcome is a higher price, PM, a smaller quantity, QM. The way the monopolist maximizes its profits is to find the quantity in where marginal revenue is the same as equal to marginal cost. If you haven't already come across this concept, I promise you, in a first year Principles of Microeconomics course, you will get this particular concept and this particular comparison. A monopolist, as compared with a competitive industry, charges a higher price, produces a smaller quantity, and the two things go hand in hand. And what happens then is there is a transfer of consumer surplus from consumers to the monopolist, and there will still be some, because of the slope demand curve, there will still be some consumer surplus, less available to the remaining consumers who consume, and there will be a social loss from monopoly. In addition to this transfer, there is this what's come to be called deadweight loss, where people who were able to buy when the competitive industry was charging a lower price no longer are able to buy when the monopolist is charging a higher price. And those consumers go off, they buy something else, but which is of less value to them. And this triangle, and economists will typically describe this as a dead weight loss triangle, is a rough and ready measure of the social waste from monopoly, as well as this rectangle being a distributional consequence of monopoly. So the origins of antitrust, they go back to 1890, the Sherman Act, John Sherman was a senator from Ohio, and this was a time of rapid industrialization, but also growing corporate power. The ways that corporations got together at the time was through legal arrangements that were called trusts. And so the Sherman Act was considered an act of antitrust. And just a little known fact, John Sherman, the senator from Ohio, whose name is on the act, was the brother of William Tecumseh Sherman, the Civil War general for the Union forces, who led the Union forces in their march through Georgia. John Sherman, the brother of William Tecumseh Sherman. The Sherman Act covered and continues to cover price fixing and monopolization. I'll come back to that. In 1914, the antitrust laws were expanded to cover mergers, to cover what's called vertical restraints. The the condition in a contract, say, by a manufacturer vis-a-vis its independent distributors of things they can and cannot do. It also covers price discrimination. The same year, the Federal Trade Commission was created by the FTC Act and given antitrust enforcement powers. The individual states have antitrust laws, and we're seeing the states getting increasingly involved in antitrust lawsuits. I'll come back to that. After World War II, before, up until I think 1940, the end of the Second World War, the United States was the only country in the world that had antitrust laws. After the Second World War, antitrust spread gradually to most other markets-oriented countries. Japan early on got an antitrust law framework because General Douglas MacArthur, who was the Allied forces individual who was, until Japan established its own post-war government, Douglas MacArthur was the essentially governor of Japan, and he was a big believer in antitrust. The UK got their antitrust laws first in 1948. The European Union got its first antitrust laws, I think in the late 50s. China got its first antitrust law about 15 years ago, and nowadays over 100 countries have, again, what they call competition policy laws. What's covered? Price fixing and other anti-competitive agreements. Typically we think of collusive smoke-filled room agreements, cartels. Sometimes it's called bid rigging, when it's groups of suppliers that get together to agree on the price that they will bid on a contract. It covers monopolization, predatory and or exclusionary actions that protect or enhance market power. And again, it's important to remember the Sherman Act does not mention monopoly itself. The language is about monopolization. The laws cover mergers, especially since the Clayton Act. And by mergers, we mean merger and acquisition, or even joint ventures. JV is joint venture that create or enhance market power. It covers vertical restraints, buyer-seller relationships that enhance market power. And the Federal Trade Commission has a catch-all phrase that is called unfair methods of competition, which really covers any of the above. How is it enforced in the US? The US Department of Justice has a separate division called the Antitrust Division. I was the chief economist of the division from 1982, beginning of 82 through August of 1983. And the Justice Department has powers to bring criminal suits for price fixing. These are felony offenses, and there are and continue to be jail terms, real jail terms for executives who have violated the antitrust laws, and large fines for companies. The Justice Department typically brings civil suits for other issues besides price fixing. These will involve injunctions to stop the behavior, stop the merger. The structural break them up remedies under the antitrust laws nowadays are quite rare. I'll come back to that later. U.S. Federal Trade Commission can bring civil suits, and again, that involves injunctions. The United States is relatively unique in that private parties can bring lawsuits to stop behavior and can receive trebled damages if they can demonstrate to a court that they have been harmed by the illegal activities under the laws. And a major Supreme Court case recently involved consumers who were suing Apple, claiming that Apple's App Store was charging fees that were monopolistic. And this is a class action suit. The litigants hope to be able to recover treble damages, 3 times what they think they can demonstrate in the way of harm. State attorneys general are getting involved in civil suits as well. And again, I will come back to that. What are some of the alternatives to antitrust? Well, there's government regulation of prices, and we see that kind of regulation where we see local public utilities like local electricity, natural gas, water, landline telephone, where arguably the local distribution is what would be called a natural monopoly. There really is no feasible antitrust policy that would work. And so instead of trying to create competition, we simply have local public utilities that are we have local regulation of those local public utilities. Some aspects of healthcare are regulated nowadays, despite the fact that, at least in my view, housing is a competitive market. We see local rent control. New York City, where I live, has a continuing regime of rent control that goes back to the Second World War. Other communities have instituted forms of rent control. We sometimes see government ownership and operation of essential facilities and public goods, local electricity, local water supply. For example, though I was born in Brooklyn, just before my 5th birthday, my family moved out to West Los Angeles. Well, Los Angeles is supplied its electricity and its water by not a private company, but by LA Water and Power, a part of the city government of the city of Los Angeles. So we sometimes see, and there are other examples of that, more common outside the United States, but we do see that as well. Yet another alternative, just grit your teeth, hope that entry in the long run will erode market power, that over the long run we'll get some kind of competitive inroads on what appears to be the exercise of market power. And those who are, shall we say, doubtful about the positive consequences of antitrust, I'm not one of them, but those who do will remind you that government failure, that government doesn't always get it right. Government actions can make things worse, and that can be a problem as well. It's important to remember there are exemptions from antitrust. Here's a list: agriculture, fisheries. Nowadays, sports is getting more antitrust attention. The professional leagues are exempt, but the National Collegiate Athletic Association, the NCAA, is not exempt. And there are important lawsuits percolating through, they are private suits, percolating through the courts as we speak. There are some other, and there are the two bottom bullet points here. Government activities are exempt under what's come to be called the state action doctrine, and political activity, petitioning the government, First Amendment rights, are exempt from the antitrust laws. All right, there are some recent controversies. Well, in the merger area, a couple, like 2 years ago, the AT&T Time Warner merger was an actively contested merger. The Justice Department tried to stop it. That went up to a Circuit Court of Appeals who sided with AT&T and Time Warner. T-Mobile Sprint was a merger that was proposed a year and a half ago. It went to court just this past January, where the Justice Department had already reached a compromise with T-Mobile and Sprint. The state attorneys general were not happy. They went into court. They tried to stop that merger. They did not succeed. And so that merger has now been completed as well. And I mentioned at the beginning, just this past week, Visa Plaid merger has been challenged. The Justice Department has announced we are prepared to go into court to stop this merger. Another major issue is how to analyze what has come to be called two-sided platform markets. And about 2 years ago, major Supreme Court decision in a case that involved American Express credit cards and the merchants who accept them. And, credit card is a classic case where the credit card provider, American Express or Visa or MasterCard, is dealing with cardholders on the one hand and merchants on the other. And each of those could be considered a separate market. And the credit card company is the platform that is trying to deal with the two-sided those two markets. Another important issue, what to do about patents and copyrights. Public policy treats those patents, copyrights, also trademark, as intellectual property. And there's a continuing issue. Should anytime anybody has a patent or has a copyright, should that be considered a monopoly? We could spend the rest of the day just talking about that. Fascinating topic. What to do about Google, about Facebook, about Amazon. I'll come back to Google and I'll briefly mention Facebook. What to do about healthcare, patented drugs, and again, back to this intellectual property issue, but also hospital mergers have considerably consolidated the hospital sector of the economy. What to do about those? In Europe, they have a much stronger legal provision called abuse of a dominant position that the European antitrust enforcers are using vis-a-vis Google, vis-a-vis Facebook. They're looking hard at Amazon. They've used it in the past against Microsoft. Very active policies in Europe. All right, merger policy, background. The goal of US merger policy: prevent the creation or enhancement of market power through a merger or acquisition or a joint venture that is not offset by sufficient efficiency improvements. In essence, merger policy asks, is this merger likely to make things worse in terms of market power? And again, it's not about pure size. And the language of the Clayton Act, 1914, over 100 years old, still is the operative language where in any line of commerce, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, enforced by the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission. And it can apply to both seller power and to buyer power. All right, I wasn't sure how much time I would have. I provide you with a typical merger analysis where firms A and B compete and what the kinds of questions the antitrust guys will ask in trying to figure out, is this an anti-competitive merger? These were exactly the kinds of questions that got asked with respect to the Sprint T-Mobile merger when the antitrust division was considering it a little over a year ago, and when the state attorneys general went into court to try to stop the merger in January. Exactly these kinds of questions. And again, Alyssa, you're going to email everybody a copy of these slides so people can look more closely at all of those individual. They are fascinating. We could spend the rest of the day just talking about this stuff. And when we're talking about mergers between competitors, there are two approaches that the antitrust guys use. One's called coordinated effects, one's called unilateral effects. I'm not going to take the time now. Again, if you're interested in the topic, you'll get the slides from Alyssa, and I'm happy to answer any follow-up questions. A more interesting case, a category, and this came up in the AT&T Time Warner merger a couple of years ago, where A and B don't compete, but they are in a supplier distributor, what the economists would call a vertical or upstream downstream relationship. And these are the kinds of questions that get asked there. All right, now I'm going to finish up by talking about the recent case. Again, this case was filed on October 20. Basically 3 weeks ago. October 20 was a Tuesday. So this coming Tuesday will be the 3-week anniversary. It primarily charges that Google has monopolized, notice, monopolized search. They were joined by 11 states. Other states didn't want to join, but they may bring their own suits. This is likely to be a lengthy case. It's going to continue for years. The FTC previously investigated Google. They were looking at different things than the Justice Department has examined. The FTC decided not to pursue the case in 2013. I should have mentioned here, the European antitrust enforcers have pursued a similar case, similar to what the FTC charged, and they have fined Google somewhere around $5 billion. That's real money. The case is likely to be continued, and I would think is likely to be strengthened by the Biden administration. Again, we'll see what happens. I'm not sure. But also, and this comes back to the question that was asked about Facebook, it's likely to be followed soon by a suit by the FTC against Facebook, where I believe, this case is going to be about the Facebook's position in online advertising. Can't go into a lot of detail now. I don't know what the FTC case is going to specify, but there is likely to be a case. All right, what is the Department of Justice claiming? They're claiming Google has a dominant position in search. It has strengthened its position. Now, and the opening part of the Justice Department suit, by the way, their document, it's a 57-page document. It's publicly available. You can get it from the Department of Justice website. There's lots of other sources for the 57-page document. And at the very beginning, they acknowledge 20 years ago, 2 decades ago, Google's search engine was innovative, and they don't deny the initial innovative aspect of Google, but the crucial aspect is Google has maintained or strengthened its position by, and there are 2 big points. They've been paying Apple somewhere between $8 and $12 billion per year. That's real money. To install the Google search engine as the default on all Apple devices. And they've been paying cell phone manufacturers and other online device manufacturers to install the Google search engine as the default and exclude other search engine providers. The consequences: diminished competition in search, higher prices for search engine linked advertising, lower quality service. For example, lots of people are unhappy with the way Google uses the private information that gets gathered as a consequence of search patterns. And the suit claims reduced innovation. Google's response: we've got a large share of search because users choose us. They want us. They're not being forced. They want us. Those payments, we're just buying shelf space. And that's just like a breakfast cereal, and they've used this language and this metaphor. Breakfast cereal manufacturer that pays for eye-level shelf space and end-of-the-aisle displays in supermarkets. Other search engines, they're just a click away. It's not like we have created huge barriers to entry. And even for search itself, for specific kinds of search, the relative competitors are not just the other search engines, but specific sites. For product searches, people go to Amazon. They don't come to, or a lot of them go to Amazon rather than coming to Google. For news searches, a lot of them go to Twitter. For travel searches, to places like Expedia or Kayak. Restaurant searches, OpenTable, etc. So, we face a lot of competition. Competition is just a click away, and people use us. We've got a large share of search because that's a choice they make. They could choose something else. They choose us. All right, this will not be an easy case for the Department of Justice to win. They're going to have to really show consumers have been harmed, and that may end up being difficult. Also, a remedy may be difficult. What do you do? Even if you think there's a problem, what do you do? And a lot of the advocates of the case point to, well, Standard Oil was broken up in 1911. The former AT&T landline system was broken up in 1984. So let's break up Google. What they forget is there are no physical facilities that can be geographically divided. Standard Oil had a whole bunch of different refineries and pipelines and oil wells. Those could be physically separated, divided. AT&T landline system had a whole bunch of local operating companies and had long distance facilities, had manufacturing facilities. They could be broken up. Much harder to do something analogous for Google. And if you think, well, those contracts are the problem, would a court be willing to say to Google and Apple, we're not going to let you sign that contract. We're not going to let Apple negotiate with Google in this way. And the thing to remind you is you're going to see economists on both sides. The Department of Justice first has a large staff of very good economists, but they will be hiring outside experts as well. Google has a staff of very good economists, and they will be hiring outside experts. All right. One intriguing possibility. This has not been talked about much in the media, but it's worth thinking about. The way those payments from Google to Apple have been portrayed as, they're buying shelf space, they're preventing other search engines like Bing, like DuckDuckGo, like Yahoo from getting that shelf space, from becoming the default on on Apple devices. But, and this is purely speculative on my part, I have no knowledge of whether there was anything of this kind going on. I'm not the first one to have thought of this. I got the idea from a friend who got it from someone else. But suppose Google was paying Apple, it was keeping the other guys away, so as to discourage Apple from developing its own search engine and then putting Apple's search engine as the default. Well, at that point, that has the flavor of an anti-competitive agreement between Apple and Google not to compete. And that's a clear violation of the antitrust laws. And I don't know, again, this is purely speculative, but if there are emails, if there are internal memos, this case could become even more interesting. So here's my conclusion. I talked to you about the strengths of markets, the problems of markets. Antitrust addresses one of those problems. I gave you the background on antitrust. I truly believe the current suit against Google is going to be very interesting. Economic insights can contribute and have contributed significantly to good policy. They're going to contribute on both sides to the Google case. And as the radio broadcasters of the 1930s used to say, stay tuned. So thank you again for the opportunity to talk to the group. I know I've gone a little long. I apologize for that, Alyssa, but there it is. Let me stop my screen share. And there we are back. And so we've got a little bit of time. If anybody has any questions, be happy to address them. And again, immediately after we're finished, I'm going to send my slide deck to Alyssa, who I hope will forward it to everyone. So, what can I do for you, Alyssa?
Yeah, so we have a few questions in the chat, but I don't think we'll have time to get all of them. So for everyone who doesn't get your questions answered, Professor White, would it be okay for them to email you and reach out?
Of course.
Okay.
I'll try to keep my answers very short so that we can get to as many as possible.
Yeah, so I think we'll only be able to go through a few of them. So the first one was, what is the threshold in market power before the government begins to implement antitrust laws?
Excellent question, and there is no bright line number. Obviously, bigger companies attract more attention than smaller companies, but there is no bright line. And there are smaller companies that have attracted antitrust attention, both on the price fixing side, on the monopolization side, on the merger side. There's got to be some kind of significant effect, but what significant is, it gets defined in every case.
Okay, thank you. The next question we have is, do social media companies such as Facebook fall under antitrust laws?
Oh, yes, for sure they do. And as I said, the Federal Trade Commission, one of these days, is likely to be issuing a suit, going into court to accuse Facebook of anti-competitive, unfair methods of competition.
All right, our next question is a bit longer. So it is, how do you feel about the recent uptick in M&A activity? Will that be good for ensuring profitability in this recession through synergies? Will it hurt the economy and weaken long-term technological development?
Woo, woo. That's, there likely will be an uptick because there are weakened companies from the COVID and from the recession. The antitrust guys are going to be paying close attention. And I hope they're doing their job. And I believe in the Biden administration, I think they're going to get even tougher and make sure they are stopping the anti-competitive mergers and only allowing greater efficiency mergers to go through. But that's going to be a set of decisions by the Antitrust Division and the Federal Trade Commission. It's ahead of time, it's real hard to predict that.
All right. I think we'll only have time for one more question. So our last question will be, how do current big tech corporations compare to the big corporations of the Gilded Ages in terms of their power over the market? And how does this change the target of antitrust legislation?
Woo. Okay, good question. in some respects, the companies involved, even though they have a big place in our minds, in our psyches, in our everyday life, are not all that large. The size of Facebook in terms of the number of employees, it's a large company. It's bigger than your local mom and pop grocery store, but it's not a giant. On the other hand, Amazon is a giant company when it comes to employees. They are the second largest employer in the United States, with I think now it's above 600,000 employees. Walmart is the largest employer with more than 1.5 million employees. So the size of now tech companies range. In terms of market value, in terms of stock market value, it turns out the 5 largest stock market value companies are all tech companies. Amazon, Apple, Google, Facebook, and Microsoft. So the largest 5, they're all tech, but that's just the stock. That's just the stock market. In terms of the actual direct impact on the economy, it varies. How does this compare to the past? Well, Standard Oil, around the turn of the century, pretty big company for the time, had a major position in a major fuel for the United States. Railroad companies, which were the subject of a number of antitrust cases, as well as being regulated by the Interstate Commerce Commission at the time. Large companies, the U.S. economy is a large economy. We are at somewhere GDP of 21, maybe $22 trillion now. We have a large economy. We can accommodate a lot of, medium to large companies who may, again, have a lock on our piece of our brain, but in terms of actual employee size, sales revenue size, with the exception of Amazon, may not be all that large. So let me stop there. Again, you've got my email address. I'll say it out loud: lwhite, all one word, at stern.nyu.edu. I'm easily found if you go on the NYU Stern website. Happy to continue the conversation, happy to address any questions. Alyssa, thank you very much for all of this. And again, to those of you who are in the finals, good luck. I hope it all, I hope for the best. Hope for the best.
Thank you so much, Professor White. Again, I'll attach the slide deck and send it out to all the participants here so you guys can review it afterwards. And yeah, we really appreciate you taking your time to speak with us today, Professor White.
Happy to do it. Really happy to do it. Thank you, Alyssa, for inviting me in the first place. This is a great, and I hope many of you, economics is not for everybody. I know that. But I hope many of you will find economics to be worthwhile. At least take an economics course or two when you get to college or university. Maybe a few of you will decide it's worth majoring in economics. Maybe some of you might decide you want to go on and do graduate work in economics. It's not for everybody, I know that, but it may be the right thing. It resonates with you. And that would be a good thing. So thanks again for the opportunity.